All righty. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Jeff Koshin West. I am the founder of Mineral Transformative Bodywork. And today we're doing ITB Sunday School. Today is May 3rd. Today we're going to be talking about archetypes, which is a pretty, in the new age, in a lot of new age circles and healing communities, this is a pretty common term and a pretty common kind of reference point. But I have found that a lot of folks, there's a lot of different contention, different ideas about what these things are, what they aren't. And also what we want to focus on today, what I'd like to talk about is how to use them or how not to use them, and how they can impact our world, and how we in ITB suggest the application of them and working with them. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to basically, as usual, we're going to go through a basic outline. And please feel free to get in the comments and make some questions, ask some questions. If you want to stop me during any part of the process, just wave your hand, let me know. And we'll just keep going and ask some questions about, if you like, about archetypes and all that jazz. This is jargon heavy, oftentimes, this type of conversation and language. So I'll try and unpack that as much as I can as we go and as we get through the process and talk, hit certain territory where there may be some new language and some ideas that are unfamiliar to you. So we're gonna go ahead and jump on in. Okay, archetypes. What is an archetype? An archetype, as most people identify them, come from the work of Carl Jung and his investigation into Carl Jung was a was the founder of psychoanalysis. In his Jungian tradition, he was very involved in identifying what we call archetypes, and they are identified as structures within human consciousness. They are kind of resources or power sources. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, but he kind of coined the phrase and kind of talked about this a little bit more. And he believed that we humans, when it comes to our mental health, we need a healthy relationship to our archetypes, to these structures of consciousness that exist within our psyche, within our mind-body experience, and also in the culture. All right, because a culture is made up of a bunch of individual human beings that are participating with an extremely similar psyche. And to use some more recent kind of concepts, that we are a bunch of human beings, human bodies that are tuning into the ocean of consciousness that surrounds us on this planet. And the ocean of consciousness, within this ocean of consciousness, lay the structures of consciousness, and these are the archetypes. And so when we are being human, we are consistently referencing these archetypes. And so let's get a little bit more specific about what an archetype is. And in saying all that, let's get a little bit more specific. So an archetype, we'll use our first example. The first example, and a common type of an archetype that's gets thrown around a lot, is father or mother. And so on this planet, we have babies. We raise our young, okay? And that's, it's not just human beings. That's pretty much all creatures on this planet in some form or fashion contribute to, aside from insects and all that jazz, as soon as we start hitting more advanced nervous systems and brain nervous systems, including the brain and spinal cord, as we start to see more and more of that occur and more complexity arise in the creature, we start to see parental habits, parental practices, and in very, very, very low sophistication nervous systems, we don't see a lot of that. So there's not a whole lot of training, there's not a whole lot of grooming. Basically, offspring emerge and then they're on their own for many insects, maybe, and many really basic life forms on this planet. So there's not really a whole lot of family that goes on. There's not a whole lot of fathering or mothering that the parent of those offspring actually go through. But as you start to emerge into more sophisticated psyches, especially where there's more communication, and especially when you start to see a group type of a dynamic occurring, a group or a tribe of those creatures getting together, you very much do start to see these kinds of uh, modes of training the offspring and caring for the offspring in some form or fashion, and a parenting process that occurs. Now, we can start with something like mother or father, or we can stick with something that's really, really basic, like just parent. And so what we start to see is in the developing psyches, the developing nervous systems on this planet, is more and more contribution from the parent onto the young, onto the youth, in how to be whatever the creature is. So if we're looking at a pack of wolves, you're going to see parenting occurring from different sources within the pack, but they're going to be primary sources that are going to be teaching things. And maybe relating certain affection and different things along those lines. Affection, grooming, basic care, basic support, and basic attachment and things along those lines. And that will extend as the pup, as the youth, as the child wolf starts to evolve a little bit more and move into their autonomy. But we do see these parental guidelines, these like naturally forming parental things that occur. And so we see this in a lot of advanced species around the planet, this parental guidance, this parental kind of format of being a parent, of being nurturing, of coaching, of kind of taking the youth through some type of process towards becoming whatever the adult version, in this case, a wolf. So the pup is slowly raised and trained and guided and kind of tutored and indoctrinated into the tribe of the wolf pack, and is taught etiquette, is taught a pecking order, a hierarchy, and is taught how the interactions are supposed to occur. And so this is really similar to what we humans do with our youth. So in this case, what we start to see is this model of the parent as this provider, as this caretaker, as this educator. And of course, in pack situations, it's not just the quote unquote mother and father, the lead parents, but the lead parents do provide this very specific thing. And we see something branching off into aunts and uncles and different things along those lines, those responsibilities. And we do sometimes see the splitting of also what can roughly be called kind of these gender outlines and whatnot. And those are very skewed in the animal world. They are not in the human world. They are unfortunately a little bit more specific, but also not limited to just those things. But we humans have this tendency, because we are a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more problematic. We start to create these kind of guidelines for what a father is supposed to do and what a mother is supposed to do. And we'll kind of talk about this whole, the value of gendering these things, and also how it can limit us. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the parent archetype is a format of how to caretake. It is an archetype of how, on this planet, parents caretake for their young. Especially as you go up in sophistication of the nervous system and of psyche that exists in these creatures. So in what we like to call in science, high-functioning brains, in creatures similar to humans, primates, elephants, horses, whales, dolphins, different things along those lines, you start to see a little bit more sophistication and a little bit more nuanced care for the young and raising for the young, or raising of the young, and kind of their way of caretaking. And those archetypes continue to kind of, a rough archetype continues to show itself as it goes throughout all the different species on this planet of sophisticated nervous systems. So we do see these things kind of emerging. Of course, there is no way to quote unquote, if we're going to talk integral for a second, there is no it quadrant evidence for an archetype. We mostly just see correlates. So what that means is that you cannot find anywhere in the cosmos the archetype of the physical manifestation of the archetype of the parent or the father or the mother or the king, the queen, the warrior. We can't, there's not just like this somewhere, as far as we can tell, at least so far. There's not some weighable, quantifiable archetype that we can put on a scale or measure in some form or fashion and say, oh yeah, that's definitely the king archetype or the queen archetype or the parental archetype. Those don't exist in the physical realm. These are structures of consciousness, as I mentioned before. They exist within this experience of awareness that we all share. that all creatures on this planet seem to share in different varieties of sophistication and basicness along the way. So these archetypes are, like I said, you can't physically point to them, and you will most likely never see them in your psyche unless you hallucinate them or unless you project upon them. But they are constantly functioning in our eye interior experience, and they are essentially there that we push off of, and they seem to be inherent to our human experience. We don't, since we can't really talk to other sophisticated creatures on this planet in this type of a sophisticated way to find out if they have the same experience or if they kind of term things the same way. We don't really know what the other species on this planet are actually going through when they're maturing or when they're dealing with these different types of energies inside of them, and if they can connect to them the same way that we do. So until that day comes, we're kind of on our own with our human experience, and we have to deal with that. So in the history of archetypes, as I mentioned before, this gentleman by the name of Carl Jung studied with, I think it was D.T. Suzuki, and who was a Rinzai Zen. Let me just say Zen because I'm not sure what school he's from, but with a Zen priest. And in the Zen Buddhic tradition, they definitely have these types of structures of awareness or structures of consciousness. They have a different term for them, of course, but they kind of, Jung and Suzuki kind of had these dialogues, and Jung kind of like had some his own interpretations of these things, and also presented them to the world and to the Western world and the English speaking world in a certain way. And so that's where most of us kind of get the idea of archetypes. That's where that term, specifically the term archetype, actually comes from, is from Jung's perspective, is Jung's language. And it's kind of like the form in which all that structures which all these kind of forms come out of. So if we're thinking of something like parent, the suggestion is that in the human experience of consciousness, there is this source and structure of this thing called the parent archetype. And so when human beings start to exhibit and exude those types of parental duties or performances and different things along those lines, the suggestion is that natural kind of momentum to parent comes from that archetype, and because that archetype is a structure inside of us as well as in our collective experience, the ocean of consciousness that we sit in. So not only do we have that archetype that resides in us to a certain extent, because we are humans and we exhibit this human body and this human experience, but also that structure exists in this collective consciousness that occurs, this ocean of consciousness that is just freaking everywhere. And so they are kind of not only this huge source in the collective, but also a source in us. That's kind of like these channels, these connections. So this is kind of the idea of how archetypes and these relationships to archetypes occur. It is suggested that if a person is kind of intuitive and innate and can kind of just feel their inner parent, then they are quote unquote connected to that archetype and they have a healthy relationship to that archetype. Now, if a person struggles with parenting or has a hard time with that, or is maybe even possessed by parenting, can't tell the difference between, well, we'll get to that in a second. I don't want to load too much on our plate right now. If a person has a poor relationship and maybe has a hard time connecting with that parental role and that parenting momentum and parenting energy, then some people will say it could be assumed or could be suggested that that individual has a hard time connecting to their parental archetype and can't tune into those natural structures internally nor externally. And that's kind of how these terms are kind of used and kind of how this language kind of occurs. And so if you have a good relationship to the archetype, you're able to kind of express and exude and use that archetype and express that archetype. If you have a poor relationship to that archetype, it may feel foreign to you, it may feel vacant, it may feel numb to you when it's time for you to perform those parenting skills. And so that's usually how this language kind of goes. So we can kind of like begin with that idea. So the idea, or also before we go forwards, the other thing we want to make sure of clarifying is that Jung did not quote unquote discover these things. He just kind of named them and put them in his own kind of language. He contributed definitely to, one could say, maybe the modernization of these things, the modernization of this conversation. But archetypes, the archetype itself, the structure of consciousness, certainly existed on this planet before Jung came around and started pointing at them and started calling them archetypes. So in the history of humanity on this planet, we've been talking about through stories and myths and legends and different things along those lines, we've been kind of talking about archetypes forever. Okay, whenever we talk about the hero or the villain or some representation of a higher power or a source, whenever you hear in any indigenous tradition or ancient people's tradition, where they talk about the great mother or the great father, where they talk about source, or where they talk about the creator. These are all ways of talking about archetypes to a certain extent. When they talk about the trickster, when they talk about the villain, when they talk about in Christian Catholic tradition, Christian Catholic tradition, you talk about the devil. When you talk about these different archetypes, or when you talk about these certain specific characters in these stories, in these really powerful myths and stories, you're talking about archetypes essentially. And so if you want to learn more about this, this is a great point to this is a great time to point out some really wonderful resources for this. Some of my all-time favorites for this is, you can read Jung's stuff. There's plenty of Carl Jung stuff out there. He wrote several books on this stuff. That may be helpful. I find that it's easier to kind of tell the story of what archetypes are and identify what they are, especially in a modern conversation. It's easiest to kind of point to, what's his name, Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was famous for pointing out how these archetypes kind of exist around the world in our myth telling, in our legend telling, in our storytelling, which is, storytelling and myth telling is innate to humans. All right, we've been doing this for an extremely long time, telling the stories of those that came before us, telling the stories about how life came to be. This is a major, basic, fundamental component of the human experience, is trying to explain what the heck is going on here on planet Earth and in this experience of being human. So storytelling, myth telling, legend telling, creation telling, these stories are really innate to us, really foundational to us as human beings. And so Joe Campbell did a really great job of putting this information together. He was a hell of a researcher. He really put his views and ideas together beautifully. Probably his most famous book was, what was that? Masks of God. What was it? Oh no, I lost it. The Power of Myth. Okay, I had to check my reference, my library there real quick. The Power of Myth. There was literally, you can even find on YouTube and on certain platforms for viewing documentaries, a very long, extended, I think it's like 6 or 7 parts, interview and conversation with Joe Campbell and Bill Moyers, talking about the power of myth and where he got these ideas and how they evolve. And so if you are wanting to look at a beginner kind of a guide, the book Power of Myth, and also reading the Power of Myth first, and then also watching those interviews with Joe Campbell and Bill Moyers, is extremely informative, super, super, super helpful. So you can find those on YouTube. You can also find those, like I said, on different broadcasting platforms. And The Power of Myth is a very, very, very well-known book. So Power of Myth is very helpful from Joe Campbell. He also wrote another book called The Hero's Journey. He also talked about the masks, one of the books that, if you're really wanting to geek out on some of this stuff and look at some of his more primary research that he put together, he created a 4-part series called The Masks of God, and that is just a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant read. Of course, like I said, it's a little bit nerdy, so if you're just looking for general information, I would not start with The Masks of God. I would start with The Power of Myth and all that jazz, and kind of look at those multimedia experiences, because The Masks of God are kind of heavy stuff. So don't start there unless you are already like kind of an academic in this stuff and you already have some experience and you want to dive deeper into Joe Campbell's perceptions of archetypes and the storytelling myth stuff. So we want to understand that Archetypes are natural to our human experience, and they are structures in which we reference reality and how we imbibe those relationships. So this is a really kind of great way to kind of think about archetypes. They are the thing that kind of naturally kind of shows up in the human experience in relationship to how we do relationships and all that jazz, and how we know how to lead in a certain way, or act like a warrior in a certain way, or act like a parent in a certain way, act like a like royalty in a certain way, or act like a trickster in a certain way. These things are kind of innate and inherent in us human beings. And that's the suggestion, is that the reason they're innate, the reason we come by them so naturally and honestly, is because they exist as structures in our identity. Now, Wilber, you all know that ITB is very much founded on integral theory, and one of the primary voices in integral theory, or primary influences that we point to in integral theory, is Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber had a really wonderful kind of translation of Jung's work, and that is the one that we also put forth here, because I think Wilber was dead on as far as this is concerned in the archetypes. He suggested that they probably shouldn't have been named archetypes. Jung had this tendency to kind of elevate archetypes to these huge levels of, like, they are gods, they are the controllers of us. And he's partially right on that whole thing. But Wilber kind of pointed out this really nice thing, is that they ought to be called probably prototypes, because what we notice from the integral map, one of the many things that the integral map reveals, is that in the conversation of this thing called structure of archetypes, or structures of consciousness in our experience of consciousness and awareness, in this conversation, what we notice is that the archetypes are very specified kind of characters. They're very specified ways, very specific ways of doing life, of doing relationship, of doing existence. And so what Wilber is kind of pointing out by saying we ought to call these prototypes is that any prototype, any one of these structures of consciousness, none of them are big enough, diverse enough, deep enough, vivid enough to hold the vividness and the magnificence and the diversity and the depth and breadth of our human psyche. So this, I think, is probably one of the most important things to know about the archetypes, is that they are amoral. They don't really care about us. They're not sitting around hoping for humans to get it. They just kind of are there. Similar to the way the sun is just kind of there. The sun doesn't care if you sit in it too long and then get burned. The sun, it doesn't matter whether you have a burger for lunch or whether you go on a brand new diet and make your life better. The sun really doesn't have a vested interest, as far as we can tell. All evidence points to the sun not really giving a shit about us. It's just there as a source. It's simply radiating. All right. And so the same thing kind of goes for archetypes. They're amoral. They don't care about us. They're just kind of sources of power, structures of power, sources of this flow and this thing that occurs, depending on whatever the relationship is. And so how we make relationship to that source is of great importance. And I think this is where, Wilber is dead on with this conversation of prototypes, is we have to kind of honor that, even though if we take an archetype like, the father or the king or the mother or the queen, if we take one of these archetypes, we have to recognize that that archetype's great for what it does, but that archetype is not big enough for the diversity and vividness and dynamism that is the human experience. So that only those archetypes, let's just use king and queen. The king and queen, they're great, but like I said, they are not the totality of the human experience. There's definitely other voices and other components and other momentums in us human beings that we need to be awake to. In fact, in Jungian's in a Jungian type of a view, and in the conversation with a lot of folks when it comes to the archetypes, when it comes to health and healing of the mind, If you are not including the other archetypes, that's where we really run into a lot of problems. That's where we run into a whole lot of hangups for the mind-body experience, for the psyche, is if I do not include the other archetypes, it can be costly to me as a human being. So if I'm only identifying as a king or as queen, I'm leaving out the rest of my dynamism. I'm leaving out the rest of my wholeness. And we all know, if you've tuned into these conversations in the past, whatever you leave out, or if you disown it, even worse, that turns into shadow. And that's very, 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 that shadow turns into a very powerful force in our life, usually not for good things. The shadow usually then, that those disowned material then just tries to invade and get its attention and get our attention, and shows up in places and messes with us in ways that are problematic. Okay. So it's good to know that we need to understand that these structures exist. They existed before Jung. Jung just kind of threw his hat in the ring and said, this is what I think is going on, and this is how I explain, and this is what I have found about it. Other folks have contributed different perspectives. One of my favorite resources, and I've mentioned this before in other ITB material and other ITB platforms, is the work of Hal and Sidra Stone with voice dialoguing. They don't use the term specifically archetypes, but when you research that material and you learn that material, they're totally talking about archetypes in the body, okay? They just simply call them voices, and that's perfectly appropriate. There's no reason why they have to adopt that language. But it also just so happens that they're both Jungian trained psychoanalysts. And so they both have that history, and they are both psychotherapists themselves. And so they definitely, the voice dialoguing work, I think, is probably far superior than a lot of the Jungian stuff that's come up, because the voice dialoguing stuff is a little bit more contemporary, and it's tried and true through a couple. That's the other beautiful thing that Hal and Sidra did for us, was they were a couple in a partnership, both professionally and then also romantically, that they kind of tried and true the process of voice dialoguing, and they both kind of contributed in a really beautiful way to what is voice dialoguing. So that's a pretty profound contribution that they made, and I think that's a more profound and a more valuable contribution than Carl Jung. But I mean, hey, props to Carl for doing his part. But like I said, if you do want to learn a little bit more about that in a very nitty-gritty kind of rubber meets the road practical experience, the voice dialoguing material is brilliant. And that's also one of the things we do in ITB. I am trained in some of that material. I'm trained in that material, and that's a major component of how we relate to the archetypes, is through a lot of voice dialoguing material. Okay, so we're thinking prototypes. So let's kind of run through some of these prototypes, some of these what are called archetypes and structures of consciousness. So first and foremost, let's go back to the conversation, to that language of gender and the value of gender. So first and foremost, understand that when it comes to how these things are gendered, they are gendered based off of a specific culture, and how that specific culture identifies a specific gender and gender roles. So if you do not identify with a specific gender, perfectly appropriate, you can still use them, they're still valuable. We simply point out that even if you identify as transgender or non-binary or different things along those lines, where you don't feel just one way, if you feel several ways, then as far as we're concerned, great, excellent, right on. That's what the human experience is supposed to be like. We're supposed to not just identify with one way of being, all right? We want to create this opportunity for this kind of larger, bigger experience. So as we consider this gender conversation, we don't understand that we're not putting forth you have to be in one category or another. The idea with all the prototypes, all these structures of consciousness, is to make sure that you have a healthy relationship with all of them. And so if you happen to inhabit a quote unquote a male body, and you think you're a male and you identify as a man or as a guy, that's perfectly fine. And we remind you when it comes to this material that you are more than just, you know, this physical body and some of the cultural guidelines of this physical body. And so we suggest being very mindful of including these other components of these gendered archetypes and prototypes. So if you identify, like I said, as a guy or as a man, and you think you should only be paying attention to quote unquote masculinely gendered archetypes, you're seriously confused. That's not where we want to go whatsoever. That's a disowning of a whole component of self. So even though I identify as a male, it's one of those things where I'm just as responsible, and it's just as important for me to pay attention to the mother or the queen within me, or the witch or the sorceress, the lover version, the feminine lover, the feminine aspects of all the prototypes and archetypes that live inside of us. So we never, ever, ever, ever want to make the mistake when it comes to this gendering conversation. We never want to make the mistake that since I identify one way, I should only pay attention to these type of the similar archetypes associated with the gender I identify with. So no matter who you are and how you identify, your responsibility in relationship to these prototypes is to embody and make healthy relationship with all of them. Okay. Now, oftentimes we in ITB, in our beginning conversations, we don't really say king or queen. We oftentimes talk about royalty. Okay, so because royalty has very, very, very common connotations. And coming from our more modern assessment of storytelling, oftentimes we will, when it's valuable, identify with what a king archetype is associated with and what a queen archetype is associated with. And when you look at the broader world storytelling, there's really not that much of a difference. It's only valuable as long as it's insofar as it's valuable to you in that moment or in that process. So I can tell you from personal experience, my own process of working with the archetypes, there was an important period where I needed to connect with this thing called my experience of this king archetypal energy, just as much as it was important for me to identify and make a relationship to the queen archetype energy within me, as well as just royalty in general. So if you're going to take the journey of archetypes, take the journey of investigating them and using them in service to your health and your healing and in your integration, if you're going to take that journey and use them to translate, we must understand that we have to kind of give space for all this stuff, because there's, like I said before, they're prototypes, and not one of them is going to encompass the whole story. So for example, if I only identified as and pursued a healthy relationship with king archetypal energy, then I would be leaving out and kind of disowning the queen archetypal energy. Even though they're similar, they still mean something to me as a human body, in this human body, and as a human walking around on planet Dirt in this cosmos. So it's one of those deals where we do suggest, no matter what, you give healthy attention to each of these archetypes and kind of get to know them and work with them and feel them. Now, in my own personal story and history, queen energy, mother energy, was actually really well modeled, and I could access really nicely because my mother was an incredible queen. My mother was a wonderful mother. She really kind of embodied those traditional kind of gendered qualities. And so I had a really good guide for that, and I was able to access that in myself really simply. Whereas my history with my father and his absenteeism left this pretty serious gap of actually feeling what is considered traditional masculine energy or king energy. And that made it difficult for me to feel certain comfort with aggression and passion and going after things and moving in a more direct fashion, and the need to push into stuff rather than to receive. And these are terms that come from traditional values of my background, and we can use them as appropriate to access what they give. So we want to keep in mind that we're not trying to squash anybody's totality. We're not trying to squash the fact that we are fully gendered human beings and that we have very complex experiences of our gender. We also don't want to toss the baby with the bathwater of where we come from, because what seems to be clear, what we accept and what we see to be true for the human experience is that none of us come in here without that history of structures of consciousness. Everybody shows up in this human body with these structures of consciousness. They are inherent to our experiences. So investigating them is perfectly appropriate. Just as it's perfectly appropriate to experience the non-gendered version of these things. There is a difference in my experience, and when other people have done this work, there is a difference between the feeling of this thing called king, this feeling of this thing called queen, and this feeling of this thing called royalty. And so there are differences, and we suggest you explore them. I wouldn't say equally, but we suggest you explore them. Okay, give them space, give them time, give them an arena to teach you, and also leave the door open for, if it's at this point in time in your life, the king doesn't say much to you, great, fine, whatever, but also leave the door open to remember that that may be something that's important in another season of your life. So we never want to play the game that just because I'm not getting a really strong feel, or that I don't feel any kind of hangups, or I'm not feeling like I should be doing work with the king, that you just don't need to do work with the king. We suggest that you explore this human experience enough to where, yeah, that king thing, yeah, I made some relationship with that. I get a feel for that. And I also made a feel for created relationship and kind of get a feel for that queen energy inside of me. This is just ways of attempting to create some healthy boundaries in relationship to the dynamism that is our human experience. And since our dynamism is really, really complex for us humans, then this can create this kind of categorization others have found very helpful in just being human. So that's kind of like a little bit of a conversation around the gendering and the non-gendering of some of this stuff. Once again, in ITB, we say, sure, both and, okay? If you, no matter how you identify, we suggest, we have found that it is a worthy act to explore them no matter what, no matter how you identify. And we oftentimes raise a caution and say, be very careful, depending on how you identify in this human body, be very careful about ostracizing or disowning other, components of these structures, because the evidence suggests and history suggests that the more we kind of give away these things, the more questions kind of hang in the air, and the less organized we are in relationship to these things. And we'll say this right now, we'll touch on this later, but we will point this out now, that the less you have relationship and healthy boundaries with these energies inside of you, these prototypes, these archetypes and prototypes inside of you, the less you have healthy boundaries with them, the more you run the risk of them infiltrating and messing with your life, and almost like taking over your life, almost possessing you in a unpleasant type of a way. And we're not talking about like, Hollywood versions of possession, like with demons and all that jazz that Hollywood likes to portray. But we are talking about being kind of unknowingly taken over by them or haunted by them to a certain extent, to where we don't have a healthy boundary, connection, relationship with them. So they just kind of mess with us a whole bunch. So that's kind of where we come from as far as a lot of that stuff is concerned. So jumping into some of these qualities. A great resource for some of the information that we're about to present to you is a gentleman by the name of Robert L. Moore. He does wonderful work in relationship to this stuff. He talks a fair bit about his primary focus was archetypes. He talks about them. One of his big things was that he brought them, he gained fame through trying to heal men's issues through archetypes. So a lot of his conversation is aimed towards traditional male gender oriented things. But In ITB, it's primarily, other than myself, it's primarily inhabited, the stewards and are all female. And what they have noticed and reported back, that it really doesn't matter all that much. They can still kind of get a sense for these things. And as I mentioned before, the gendering of these things matters to a certain point. It also doesn't matter as heavily as some people think. So there's value in both camps. And so, as usual with an integral perspective, we say both and instead of either or. So when it comes to some of these conversations with royalty and with the warrior, you can gender them, but it's only useful as far as you think it's useful, and it's useful to you. Okay. So first up, we can talk about royalty. What does royalty do? Royalty traditionally is king and queen of some form or fashion. You can also break it down into another category that makes it sometimes a little bit more complex, is the mature versions and the immature versions. So we have prince and princess, okay? And so you can kind of get a sense for these guys in the work of Robert L. Moore and some other folks. They do talk about the immature versions of these archetypes as they emerge. And so it's not a bad idea to kind of feel into those to a certain extent, to explore those, and to keep in mind that we don't want to live out of perceptions that we are an immature version of these things. And so as we go forwards, we will kind of throw in some conversation about what the immature versions of these characters are. And like I said, if you want a deeper dive into this, I can't say enough about Robert L. Moore and the work he's done as far as this stuff is concerned. So he's a wonderful, wonderful resource with a lot of these mature and or the immature and mature versions. And it's just really, really great work. I can't say enough. So first off is royalty. So what does royalty do? Royalty is their primary responsibility is to get a vision, is to have a vision of where to go. So whether we're talking about the king or the queen, they are the source of inspiration. They are, royalty is meant to inspire us through sharing their vision of creating something greater. And creating something greater can take a whole lot of forms for our current human world. But royalty is really interested in creating something better for the betterment of humanity. Not only the betterment of self, but also the betterment of humanity. So royalty is really interested in expanding the realm, ordering the world, discovering the world, and kind of establishing and maintaining harmony, peace, things along those lines, and basically governing and overseeing this whole human experience, as well as overseeing and caring for whatever community it is in. So if you are a leader in some community that you're in, it can be really helpful for you to explore the relationship to your royalty, because as a leader, you're going to need a vision. You're going to need an idea of where are we going. You're going to definitely be perceived as a person of power, and so you may be inspirational to the people that you are leading, so to speak, or heading of that community, or heading that committee. So folks will inadvertently, when you move into this position of quote unquote leader, you kind of immediately get connected to this and put upon by these structures of royalty. And then how you go about doing that is, you know, makes a big deal. So makes a big difference. So as you move into those roles of lead or of director, immediately you're going to have to negotiate those royalty energies. And so the primary responsibility is to have a vision, and then to inspire the population, inspire the people, and to guide the people. Okay, so how the leader performs, how the royalty performs and proceeds, very much informs the people that they kind of are leading or guiding or watching over, or governing. So where the leader goes very much kind of guides what's up for the people who are participating. So if you're a teacher is a type of connected royalty archetype. So teacher is a guide. Teacher is the informed. Teacher is is definitely a leader. We've had just tons of teachers as leaders in our American history. And then when you open up to the rest of the world, teachers oftentimes are have been identified as great leaders, and royalty or presidents in whatever form we want to, presidents and queens and kings throughout all types of different cultures. So a teacher does have that experience. So if you do identify as a teacher or as an instructor, if that's one of the jobs you do in this world, you are connecting to that royalty energy, and that royalty energy is then being embodied by you, and how you use and how you work with that royalty energy becomes of great importance. A teacher who's connected to their royalty inspires their students. A teacher who is connected to their royalty has a vision of where they're going or where the group is going, where the students are going. Teacher is also really helpful for understanding royalty, because royalty is kind of recognized as having a direct service to God, or direct service to, evolution, to the momentum of the universe and where to go. And so in ancient stories of royalty, oftentimes royalty was equated to higher power from whatever that culture was, embodied on the planet. So whatever the king or queen said kind of goes. So if if royalty says jump, you say how high, because quote unquote higher power of that culture is saying jump. And so this imbues the royalty with and the royalty archetype inside of us with kind of like this almost sacred and holy quality. So we want to understand that when we start to feel our leadership, when we start to feel our royalty, it's kind of a sacred experience and a holy experience, and not something to be kind of willy-nilly with or irresponsible with. Leadership is a very, very, very powerful position, but as we've seen plenty of times in our human history, leadership can be abused. That power and that beauty and that sacredness and that holiness has been phenomenally abused. And so we want to keep in mind that when we start to feel our own royalty, we must also proceed with great caution in relationship to that archetype, because of course there's unending, examples of poor leadership. So when we start to feel our own royalty, the primary responsibility is to inspire, is to have a vision, and then direct, give instruction about how to achieve that goal, how to achieve that vision, how to distribute power and different things along those lines. So if we take this back from kind of like the story of humanity, or kind of a teacher or a group leader, and make it very individuated, like how do I as an individual relate to my royalty? In the human experience, what we can see here is that it comes up, and this type of relationship and this situation with royalty comes up in the conversation of what is my vision for myself? What's the vision for my life? Do I have a dream of my life? Do I have a vision for how I want to do my life and what kind of life I want to make for myself? The quick and dirty version of this when we are children is, what do you want to grow up what do you want to be when you grow up? When people ask that question, they are asking the youth that they're talking to, or the person that they're talking to, what is the vision of their life they want to have? How do they envision, what goals that they want to have? And that's the domain of royalty. Royalty decides that for us. When we make a good relationship to our royalty, it gives us that energy, that prototype feeds us this experience of find a vision, find an inspiration, find these things in your life. And so a human being that does start to connect with their royalty energy will start to have a vision about how they want to become, what do they want to achieve in their life. And that can take all types of different forms. It can be a monetary achievement. It can be a fame type of an achievement. It can be a position in culture and community and economy. It can be a love goal. It can be a family goal. It can be a spiritual goal. It can be a religious or educational role. It can be these types of visions. It doesn't have to be just one type of vision, but it is a vision of what we want for ourselves. So if you're struggling with, what do I want for myself? Where am I going? What am I, quote unquote, what am I doing with my life? What do I want to do with my life? that's the attempt to try and connect with our royalty. And so if you are a person that's struggling with that question, the first thing we start to talk about in a very practical way is who inspires you? When if you're searching for what's my life mean, where do I want to become, how do I want to envision my life, and how do I want to create that life? If you're kind of like unaware of how to do that, the first thing we suggest in relationship to an archetypal way of working this problem is to look at the people you think are inspirational. Find the people that you think are just badasses. Find the people that you think have put together their world in a really awesome way and are walking it, are really living their dream, living their vision, living their inspiration. Find those people and kind of, it's may seem a little bit childish or a little bit silly, but pretend to make relationship to them. Look how they put their life together. Talk to them a little bit. Pretend in your imagination that they're showing up and they're coaching you and they're telling you how to go forwards. They're kind of talking to you about what's meaningful to you. Oftentimes in our personal work, what we find is that the more royalty we can identify in our external world that inspires us, the closer we start to inch towards feeling our own royalty and how we inspire ourselves and how we find a vision for ourselves. So we do want to keep this in mind going forwards, that if you have a hard time connecting with a certain archetype, you start to look for signs of that archetype in your external world. That can be super helpful. And that can be in mainstream media, that can be throughout history. They don't have to be alive. They don't even have to be real. They can be fictional characters. One of my primary archetypes for finding my own work is, Mr. Keating from Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams' character. And I mean, Robin Williams is definitely one of my, Robin Williams, the actual person, is definitely a person that I have used that I've been inspired by, that I have kind of looked to remind me of connecting with my royalty energy, but then also my creative archetypes. And so that was definitely something that showed up. But back when Dead Poets Society came out, there wasn't the same media presence about, seeing videos and all this jazz about Robin in the first place. So the only thing I had to go by was the characters he imbued or he imbibed. And so his character, Mr. Keating, was a very, very, very powerful character for me because I could really identify with that. I couldn't really identify with Robin Williams. So we do want to keep in mind when we're actually using this work in an actual life practice to start to look into the external world and see where we are inspired. That's a great place to start. So we can start with, when it comes to royalty, who seems to be living their dream? That's a really simple question for us. Look around, in not only arm's reach, but also in the outside world, in history and in the entertainment industry or in any other industry that exists. Look around and see who inspires you. And if you can identify an inspiration, you're probably identifying those values that a archetype kind of has for you. And if you're struggling when it comes to that stuff, this can be kind of a helpful play area for that. So I would literally pretend to sit around sometimes with, Mr. Keating from Dead Poets Society and literally pretend to have a conversation with the gentleman and listen to him and hear him. And when he was talking in the movies, pretend that he was talking to me, and letting that really shift me and change me and inspire me. And so when you go out to start doing this work with these archetypes, this is the kind of play, and I'm going to call it capital P play, because it's not little stuff. This isn't childish. This isn't immature play. This is this is the type of play that changes your life. This is the type of play that shifts your inner dimensionality and really kind of brings up more of your vividness and dynamism. So this type of play is really powerful for us human beings. So that's royalty. The other thing to know about royalty is royalty's power is in directing the people. So a king, or like the king or the queen, is a human being. And they are definitely limited by their the human expression. And so the real wielding of power for the king is that the king, or for the royalty, is that royalty embodies this inspirational quality. It embodies the, what's it called? They embody the inspiration. They embody the vision of the community, of the whole existence, of the whole meaning of going forwards for the community or for the individual human being. And so the real power is in embodying that. They also direct the horde. They direct the whole community. So in the human experience, the individual experience, if royalty is being worked really well, if you do have a vision, if you are inspired and you're starting to inspire yourself, the royalty in you, they are kind of directing how you then enact the plan. So they have the vision, and then they also have a plan, and they support and provide power for you to execute that plan. So royalty is super important in saying, we are going to do this, we're going to do that, and we're going to participate this way. And they start to give orders and give inspirational direction about how to fulfill the vision. The fulfillment of the vision is by the people and by the other archetypes, because the royalty themselves, they're just the vision keepers. They're the ones that are seeing the vision, or seeing the plan and seeing the direction to go. So royalty is important for that. And then the power of the royalty is exuded through the population, through the groups that then proceed after them and listen to the vision and listen to the plan, and are inspired enough to take up the power to execute the plan. So one of the ways that the archetypes are then, or one of the ways that the power of royalty is then executed or performed, is through what is considered the warrior or the guard. Okay, and once again, this is a prototype, an archetype. This is a structure of consciousness that you can either gender or not. It really doesn't matter, because when we look at warriors throughout history, warriors exude very, very, very specific things, specific behaviors, specific modes of being, at least the healthy versions. And it doesn't matter whether that's a female body or a male body. They exhibit very, very, very specific modes of being. All right. And so the primary warrior experience is to defend and maintain boundaries. So the royalty has the vision of what needs to be done. They have the plan of what needs to be done. They have the direction, and are the ones that are meant, can see the resources and then say, this is how we're going to contribute resources and skills to getting this goal fulfilled. The warrior then is the one that is meant to defend the community and make sure that the community can remain at peace long enough to fulfill the goal. The warrior is there to protect the community. The warrior is there to enforce, kind of like to enforce discipline, to remind the community. The warriors will show up to make sure that if there's rambunctious agitators in the community, they'll remind, no, listen, that's cute and all, but we're aiming towards this one direction. That's what we're working for. So the warrior is great for defending boundaries, defending and maintaining boundaries, and kind of enforcing things. So in the personal human experience, we can oftentimes talk about the warrior as being the embodiment of discipline. So it is the kind of the beginning of the disciplinary enactment. All right. So the warrior is meant to do that. Now, that's a healthy warrior. A healthy warrior doesn't make decisions. The healthy warrior does not decide the vision. The healthy warrior does not decide who we go to attack or who we don't attack. That is decided by royalty. Royalty has the vision. Royalty says, we do need to mess with that. We don't need to mess with that. We do need to focus our energy here. We don't need to focus our energy here. Royalty is also the source of kind of lawmaking and different things along those lines, guidelines for performing, guidelines for how we're going to make a life and how we're going to show up in the world. Royalty decides that stuff. Warriors do not. Warriors, dude, there are so many stories. There are so many stories throughout history where there is this conversation of what happens when you put a warrior in charge. Warlords, this is why we call them warlords and why they have such a bad rap. Warriors who become in charge are dangerous characters, because the function of the warrior, remember in the archetypal conversation, the function of the warrior is deciding maintenance of boundaries, and they don't have a vision. They're just there to maintain boundaries. Now, you can definitely, in the interior human experience, you can have a healthy relationship between royalty and the warrior. That's a great relationship. But the warrior must kind of like submit to and honor that they are in service to the vision. Okay, so if you have a warrior queen or a warrior queen or warrior royalty that is honoring a vision greater than itself, the warrior kind of does okay in history. And we have some pretty good examples of that, especially, you know, here in our country even. So if we have a person who really can connect to their royalty, but also seems to have been trained also as a warrior, they can not only defend boundaries, but they can also have a vision, and they can also execute that vision. This can be a really potent kind of a combination, and is in human beings. And so it's one of those deals where this can be very, very helpful. But if you are kind of overtaken or only identify as warrior, you're getting your orders from somewhere. Warriors get orders from something bigger. And if they don't have something bigger, that's dangerous territory, okay? Or if there's something bigger is a sick vision, then this is trouble. So in the story of archetypes, warriors are great. Just make sure that you don't put a warrior solely in charge of your world, because there may be too much rigidity, there may be too much interest in domination, in enforcement, in control. And so we have to be kind of careful along those lines. So we make sure that we connect with the warrior, but we don't allow the warrior to kind of possess us and take over control. So that's kind of what goes on as far as the warrior is concerned. So in the beginning, we really want to have, when we start this work, we really want to talk about this connection between royalty and warrior. Royalty and warrior's healthy relationship creates an individual human being who has a vision for their life and understanding how to use those resources, and that's through the royalty, and then has a healthy warrior which understands, I need to have boundaries, I need to maintain boundaries, I need to perform discipline, I need to perform the plan, I need to make sure the plan gets done. And so in an individual human being, a healthy warrior and healthy royalty and healthy warrior, these are of great importance to create a lot of stability, all right? And a human being who can kind of harness those two, we will most likely see them from the outside. They'll probably look pretty darn functional. They'll look like, especially in an American version or in a Western kind of a concept of success and wealth, they probably look like they're doing great because they have an idea of what they want in their life and how they want to allocate resources, and then they have the discipline and the action to be able to do it. The discipline and the energy in order to do it and perform those and execute those plans. So from a very Western perspective, or a very capitalistic perspective, holy crap, that stuff is, they look like they've got their stuff together. That doesn't mean that it's true, it just looks that way. So what we want to keep in mind is that that's just the beginning kind of storyline of creating a whole human being. So after that, after we kind of create this healthy dynamic between that royalty and warrior, what we then notice is that the next plan, as far as creating healthy boundaries is concerned, is we then need artisans. We then need skilled workers. Because we have resources and we have a dream to build. That means we need to have artisans, skilled workers, refined workers, specialized workers to fulfill the specialized use of resources and the specialized knowledge that's needed in order to achieve my my vision, my goal, my insight, and my inspiration. So there's kind of like this emerging storyline that kind of occurs, and this is where Robert L. Moore does a really beautiful job of talking about some of this in some of his other books and his other lectures, where the beginning of the healthy human being is the emergence of the royalty. And when you have a vision, you can then tell the warrior to go and perform it and maintain boundaries and maintain discipline. And the more you and create protection for the tribe and protection for the individual. And as the protection for the individual and the vision start to take hold, and then there's the realization of, holy crap, I need to get education in these specific fields in order to fulfill this goal, because I have the safety and the ideals and the vision of what I want to do. Since I'm safe enough and have enough resources caring for me and I have enough needs fulfilled, I can now put my energy towards, I need to make sure I know these skills so I can then execute the goal correctly. Fulfill the vision of the people correctly, so to speak. So the artisan is a very, very powerful type of a character, type of an archetype. The artisan is, in R.L. Moore's work, he talks about them as the wizard, but it's really an artisan, okay? You can also use the term scholar. Scholar is a very common archetype in storytelling and in history. And so you will start to see scholarship emerge, artisanship emerge. So you'll see the emergence of, if we're looking at an individual human being, this is where they would probably figure out what direction of education and refinement of education they would need. So if we use the analogy of a human teenager, we would hope that the human teenager would get a vision of where they want to go. They would learn healthy boundaries. So they would connect with their royalty and their warrior and create healthy boundaries, create a vision of where they want to go. And as they exit high school, or while they're in high school, they can start to make moves in order to direct. They can start to take control and make moves in order to direct where their education is at. So let's say this teenager, this human teenager, wants to become a lawyer or a doctor. At that point in time, they can start to adjust. If they realize that in high school, they make this realization in high school, they can start actually adjusting their high school education towards that outcome. And as they leave high school, as they graduate high school and start to choose their higher education, they will choose a direction that's going to support that greater vision. So they're going to start to move into scholarship. They're going to start to move into artisanship. So in my personal story, my king and my warrior came online. I was lucky enough to really make connection with them. And when I was at a very young age, I knew I wanted to teach. I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I knew I wanted to also contribute to the health and the decrease of suffering on the planet. That was a very, very strong momentum in me. So my connection to my royalty really told me that's clear that I want to be a part of that. As I matured through my high school years, that modified a little bit, and I didn't quite understand how that was going to manifest because I wasn't interested in going into public education. I also came from, not so much resources. I came from a lower middle class family. And so the concept of going into higher education was really slim. I wasn't a very good student. My warriorship was not online enough to where it made me a good academic student in school. So I wasn't a great student. I had this great momentum inside me. I did have a sense of boundaries and self-worth, and where I knew I did have a strong work ethic and healthy boundaries, but I didn't quite know how to get those then fulfilled. And as I graduated high school and then started to seek, how am I going to get this vision fulfilled? That was when I finally made contact with someone in the healing field and talked to me about massage therapy. And that was the great shift for me. Was I knew I had my connection to my royalty. I was maintaining relatively healthy warriorship boundaries and warrior energy. And the next thing had to be, well, how am I going to direct this? And where do I want to put my resources, my gifts into the world in order to fulfill this vision of decreasing the suffering on the planet and teaching people? And voila, when I made contact with the gentleman who taught me about massage therapy and that there was a school for it, it was just a matter of scheduling, quite honestly. I knew that was the direction I wanted to go. And like I said, it was just a matter of collecting some more monetary funds and then scheduling it. And it was basically, once I was in school, my life just kind of like took off. And so this is kind of a really To me, this is a relatively simple understanding of how we connect with our royalty, we connect with our warrior, and as that happens and creates stability between those two components, we start to see the emergence of the scholar or the artisan showing up, as well as the other side of the scholarship and artisan is what we call the lover. We'll get to the lover in just a minute. So the artisan or scholar can be in anything. Okay, it's not just one field of study. The umbrella guideline here of the artisan or the scholar is any domain of learning that is refined or that you need special instruction in. So this can be midwifery, this can be engineering, this can be rocket science, this can be massage therapy or healthcare of any kind, this can be law, this can be refinement of politics or marketing. This is any domain of human study that has to do with refined information and becoming refined in the performance of it. It can be whether it's in a academic world or whether it's in a truly artisan kind of building, cooking, making something, producing something that is a refined element. You know, if you're a person that makes wine, that is a part of the artisanship. If you're a person that makes cheese, if you're a person that basically makes great food or creates something in a artistic fashion, in a refined form, this is considered artisanship. This is the world of the scholar. This is the world of a refined and highly specialized type of knowledge. This is the world of this naturally emerges when we start to stabilize some of this archetypal stuff. So this archetypal energy of pursuing refinement, pursuing specialization, pursuing some component of kind of magnificence, and a defining factor here is that you're getting paid for it, is that you're getting exchange for it. So it's not just the doing of a thing just for kicks. It is the doing of a thing in order to contribute, in order to provide for oneself and for others, to contribute to the community at large. So this is where we start to see this momentum in human beings. When we start to see better stabilization between royalty and warrior, we start to see this natural momentum in human beings of wanting to then become refined in some way and sharing it with the world. And if I can get paid for it, all the better. And we highly suggest in ITB, if you're gonna go through this process of refinement, it's a really great idea to see how you can get paid for it in today's Western capitalistic culture. Because if you're gonna get refined in it, you kind of deserve to be supported by it. Now that doesn't land all the time, unfortunately, but the best suggestion we can give you when it comes to the thing that, you know, blows your hair back, a refinement or a technique or a specialization that really inspires you, really go for it and follow that charge, follow that excitement. And the majority of the time, not 100% of the time, the majority of the time, you will find some pretty profound fulfillment. Okay, that doesn't always equate to monetary fulfillment or even monetary stability, but it does contribute to the whole human being fulfillment in general. And of course, when it comes to the artisan or the scholar, this archetype, there's also sick versions of this as well. So an exaggerated version of this is a person that kind of hoards knowledge, hoards specialization, and doesn't share. Okay, a depressed version of this is kind of like a really kind of crappy jack of all trades, you know, master of none, where they kind of know a little bit about a lot of things, but there's no real kind of it's all like base level education. That's a sick version. Another sick version, even worse, is a person that just is completely uninterested in learning anything or acquiring refinement of any kind. Not even just in an artisan way or a scholarship way. They're not interested in participating in refinement or self-care or learning things in general. So those are kind of sick versions of that stuff. Every time we see an archetype, there is a healthy version and a sick version. And within the sick versions, you will see two polarities. Within the sick versions, you will see an exaggerated version, and you'll see a very, very depressed version. And not depressed as in ho-hum, depressed as in there's no life energy there. It's depleted. It's kind of sucked dry. So it's just this lost kind of expression of the archetype. And when those sick versions are kind of not being enacted, then you'll start to see a healthy version emerge and show itself. So far we've got royalty, we've got warrior, we've got artisan, and the other side of the artisan. So if you're drawing these guys out, one of the ways that we draw this is kind of like northeast or north, south, east, and west. And so in the north, we would put royalty. In the south, we would put warrior. In the east, we would put artisan. And in the west, we would put the next archetype, which is the poet or the artist or the musician or the lover. R.L. Moore talks about the lover in this case. And once again, this is not gendered. You can make it gendered. It's not gendered. It's one of those deals where it doesn't have to be gendered. It's one of those deals where if it works for you with the gendering of it, then run with it, but also don't be bogged down in that conversation. The lover is having to do with beauty, the appreciation of beauty, making things beautiful, remembering that beauty is important. So in a world where you've got a warrior, you've got warriorship and you've got artisanship, there's a risk that beauty or aesthetics may be kind of left out. And so we see this a lot of times in heavy academia, very refined areas that don't have a whole lot of, that are not influenced by beauty. Maybe engineering, maybe certain, you know, the STEM territories of education. And so these oftentimes are more focused on certain outcomes, and beauty isn't really a conversation that comes into it. The reason why beauty is kind of helpful for human beings, not kind of helpful, the reason why beauty is helpful is in human beings is because oftentimes beauty reminds us of the power of royalty. Beauty reminds us that there is something greater going on. Beauty reminds us of being inspired by the world constantly. Beauty kind of speaks to talk, you know, to reference R.L. Moore's conversation. The lover is very influenced by beauty because it seems to have a transcendent nature, and the lover is very much about our personal relationship to something that may be called spiritual or maybe be greater than us or transcendent. So the lover isn't just about, as it may sound to some of you, it's not just about sex or romance or different things along those lines that we sometimes equate with this term lover. It's more along the lines of what is our relationship to the transcendent, and how do we feel the transcendent? How do we make relationship to the transcendent? How do we express the transcendent? So this is why we'll start to see artists of different kinds, poets, musicians, painters, different things along those lines showing up. And also the world, because they are embodied and kind of and excited by sensuality. This is one of the places where in the other archetypes, sensuality is not of a primary force. Now, it is true, in the other archetypes, you can find sensuality. They all have a different relationship to sensuality. But what we find in a lot of human beings is that we oftentimes forget about, and this archetype is meant to remind us of, the incredible erotic experience of being human. Being human is full of sensory experiences. There's constantly sensations going on, not always good ones, but there's constantly sensation occurring. There's constantly emotion arising. Whether you know it or not, you're always having an emotional response to everything in your territory. That emotional response may be comfort. The emotional response you may be having is peace. The emotional experience you may be having in a place where you feel safe is the emotion of appreciation and of a sense of worthiness. There's always emotion occurring. There's always sensation occurring. Those are constantly occurring. They're inherent to our nervous system. How much we give attention to them really varies how much we're aware of them. But what we have noticed with social intelligence and emotional intelligence, you are always picking, your nervous system is never not collecting data. It is the primary responsibility of your nervous system is to constantly collect data interiorly and exteriorly about what's happening. So there's never a time where you're not having an emotion or you're not having a sensation. It's just whether you pay attention or not. One of my favorite examples of this is, it has to do with being able to see. It's really kind of comical. When it comes to your vision, your eyes always see your nose, okay? So your eyes are always seeing your nose, but because the nose is kind of understood as always being there, the brain just drops it out. It says it's not important data. It's not going to constantly be checking to see if my nose is there. So it's like, all right, well, we drop that data and it looks for other things. So the nervous system prioritizes information, prioritizes data. So the same thing goes, what we see here where I'm constantly, overlooking my nose consciously or unconsciously, the body does the same thing for the rest of the system. It has ways of constantly of knowing that it doesn't have to check on certain body parts to see if they're there. It just kind of knows it. And so the body prioritizes sensory data. So same thing goes for our whole human experience. So the lover is quite important because it reminds us of our sensuality. And in the other domains, in royalty, where we're really focused on having a vision and allocating resources and submitting to that vision, the warrior who is really interested in maintaining boundaries and caring for things and getting the job done and kind of like holding boundaries and maintaining boundaries, oftentimes can forget about, it can deprioritize sensuality. Think of this, think of like when you're maybe taking a hike and you're really interested in taking that hike and you're really focused on other stuff and you don't sense that your physical body has been scratched or injured. This is a very typical kind of warrior pushing forwards, pushing on and deprioritizing sensuality. Same thing goes when we look at the artisan or the scholar. If you've ever participated in higher education or been very excited about higher education and refinement, you probably deprioritize some sensory data or some sensuality like eating and drinking and going in the bathroom or getting some rest because you're just so excited about the stuff that you're learning. Oftentimes we see in some of these other archetypes a deprioritization of sensuality. And this is one way that the lover can be very, very powerful in these kind of beginning 4 archetypes, is that it reminds us to be sensual, to enjoy our body, that life is an erotic experience and that it's okay to be sensual in existence. It's okay to be a sensual human being, and that's a part of our health, and so the lover, the poet, the artist reminds us of this, and this is where we start to notice the emergence of more and more kind of transcendent experiences coming up, and also quote unquote spirituality emerging for some folks. And so this can be, this is a territory where the lover is very much focused on these types of qualities. The unhealthy lover, so when we look at the unhealthy lover and we push into the two polar opposites, the inflated version and the deflated version of lover, the inflated lover is just, they cannot be sated. They can never get enough. They're just constantly going from one sensory stimuli to another. They just can't get enough. They're constantly looking for their next fix. They can't be at peace. They're just looking for the next stimuli. That's the inflated, sick version. The deflated, sick version is kind of like a numbness to the world, an inability to be sensual, kind of like a totally wilted type of a relationship to sensuality, to the transcendent, that they're just kind of, there's no momentum. It's a real numbness. It's a real absence of not really caring, but just an absence of momentum towards any sensuality or care for sensuality or interest in sensuality, interest in transcendence, interest in the complete deflated interest in being in intimacy and connection with existence. So there's a lot of numbness for the deflated version of the lover, a lot of numbness, a lot of kind of like apathy, a lot of distancing, a lot of disconnection. It's almost like talking to a person and you having maybe you're having an important conversation, but they're kind of just like hanging out. It's like talking to a wall type of a thing. There's no interaction. So that's kind of a similar feel to that whole thing. So we've got these 4 primary archetypes, and this work is mostly based off of, like I said, R.L. Moore's work. I think he's one of the most profound voices in this field. So we kind of put these together in ITB. These are the archetypes as we kind of present them. And these are the primary ones that Jung and Moore and other investigators of the archetypal conversation kind of have investigated and suggested that we keep a close eye on in relationship to our mental health and our also our functionality as human beings and our full embodiment of our humanity. So in ITB, these are the ones that we really kind of focus on. Now, there are just as important secondary ones, other ones that you might have heard of. So one of them is the trickster or the fool, and that kind of equates really closely to a lot of our shadow stuff. When shadow kind of occurs, when we disown something and it gets kind of pushed away and disowned and kind of expected to be dead or not part of our world anymore, one of the primary ways that shadow tries to get our attention and remind us that those disowned parts are a part of us is through messing with us, is through trickery, is through kind of irritation and agitation of saying, you know, I'm still here, you know, there's this is I am a part of you and you've left me out, and I'm going to get your attention in creative ways in order to agitate you and remind you that you've disowned me. And so this is actually really akin, if you've ever spent time caring for children, this is really akin to the child that seems to mess up on purpose or break things on purpose or irritate you on purpose. So if you're a caregiver or a guardian of a child and they start breaking things on seemingly on purpose or messing up on purpose, kind of acting in a way that's not their normal self, in which they're kind of being irritating or being agitating or seem like they want to pick a fight. These are wonderful examples of the fool or the trickster starting to emerge and show themselves, and are, I would say 90% of the time come from these are behaviors and these are attributes that are surfacing because there's something that's being disowned or not being honored in the body. So in children, our plan is talk to the child and check in with the child, and since children are horrible at being adult human beings, they are oftentimes linguistically challenged, educationally challenged. Since they are challenged in these ways, we adults oftentimes have to offer words and offer guidance and offer support to help unfold what's going on in the kid for the child to kind of figure out what's actually up with them. So then they can learn that language, learn that information, and then use it and hopefully mature in a healthy way. Not a lot of us got that experience. So what occurs is we get a human being that our shadow material shows up in trickster ways, in foolish ways, and we as adults start to notice we're sabotaging ourselves. We're like, we ask ourselves, why did I leave my keys behind? Why did I leave my wallet at the house when I go on a trip? Why did I leave this important component for my work at home when I knew I was going to need it for work? Why did I mess up and say the wrong thing to my partner or to my friend when I knew what I wanted to say, but I said the wrong thing and did that conversation in a really foolish way, and then it blew up in my face? So when we start to see self-sabotage occur in human beings in ITB because of a lot of this work, we immediately start to say, well, all right, well, let's kind of see what's going on when that foolish behavior came up, or when you decided to be an irritator, to push people's buttons instead of being in harmony with them. What did you what was really happening for you when you decided to go pick that fight instead of, actually speak what's alive inside of you and express your needs. So in the work of being human and using the archetypes, when the trickster shows up, when the fool shows up, when the prankster shows up, we really want to pay attention to what we're feeling and thinking and seeing and perceiving when that fool starts to show up, and what the fool has to say to us and share with us, and also with the fool and the what this trickster does, the actions it wants to take, because those are usually signifiers of disowned material that's inside of us of our human experience. And so we in ITB and in several other schools, when the trickster, the fool, or the prankster shows up, oh man, you really need to pay attention, because they're usually showing up because they're trying to let us know we've disowned something. So contrary to a lot of perspectives in the world of personal transformation and mental health, our interest is you need to pay attention to what those things are. If the trickster shows up, if the prankster shows up, or the fool shows up, you need to pay attention to what they're up to and what they're doing, and you need to listen to them, because they're trying to get our attention, because something's been left out. Some bit of data is not being included in the whole human. That's why they're showing up. And so the trickster and the fool, or the prankster, these are really, really helpful. In every religious, spiritual, indigenous population tradition, you will find the archetype of the trickster. So the trickster shows up all over the place. You will find them in all kinds of different stories and things along those lines. The trickster is a lot of fun oftentimes, but the trickster is oftentimes in storylines, they're fun, but they're also pains in the ass, because they're oftentimes harbingers of chaos, and they're harbingers of chaos usually because they represent the shadow or the disowned components of a cultural perspective. So in ancient people's traditions, they're used very wisely. They're used very wise. I say that because in the ancient people's traditions, the trickster stories are always reminders that chaos exists, that we don't know what's going to happen, and that we do have to pay attention to sometimes sneaky prankster energies, both interiorly and in the world. And so they are oftentimes used very skillfully in that way. And they also remind us that we have inside of us chaotic and kind of wild natured stuff, and that if we don't listen to it, if we don't pay attention to it, it can sometimes overtake us. It can sometimes ruin our life. That doesn't mean that we need to listen to the trickster, listen to the fool, and then give them permission to run the show. It just means that we need to include them at the council table, so to speak. So if we're going to be a whole human being, and this is how we usually talk about this in ITB, if you're going to be a whole human being, you need your royalty there. You need your warriors there. You need your artisans there. You need your lovers and poets there. You also need to make room for the tricksters, because the tricksters inevitably are going to be there. And you need to invite all these characters to the party in order to gather as much data as possible for your success. So in ITB, this is the way we usually work with them. Another one I want to touch on really quick is the inner child, or the child. If you've done any kind of, especially Western investigation into archetypes or psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, there is a lot of talk about this thing called the inner child, or a child energy, or some people use the term of wounded child. And this is just my opinion. This is kind of like a heavy-handed approach to all the immature voices inside of us. And so the inner child, the wounded child, anytime child comes up, it's kind of like this heavy-handed swing at a lot more complexity. Because as I mentioned in the very beginning of this lecture, each one of these archetypes has an immature and mature version. There are immature versions of royalty, just as much as there are mature versions of royalty. And those immature and mature versions of royalty are different than the sick versions, okay? Just because something is immature doesn't mean it's sick. So there are immature royalty archetypes, and there are mature royalty archetypes, and there are sick versions of both of those. So I hope you start to hear how complex a lot of this crap can get. So we start with a general overview in ITB, but there's plenty of room to dive deeper in if you want to, okay, as is a lot of the traditions and information that we share in ITB. So this whole child conversation, wounded child, inner child, golden child, these child archetype references, like I said, they're oftentimes heavy-handed swings at more complex storylines. But essentially what they're attempting to do, whether they call them the inner child, wounded child, golden child, whatever, what they're attempting to do is remind us of potent, immature structures that are inside of us, and immature structures that need to be nurtured and cared for and also outgrown. All right, so we don't want to suggest that immature is bad, but we do want to recognize that a child, human, is going to have the manifestation of the immature archetypes that show up. And so we do want to be mindful of that. And so an example of this would be, like I said earlier in the lecture, of royalty would be the prince-princess model. And so the prince-princess model is sometimes called the sacred child. And there's tons of sacred children in in different stories from around the world. So the sacred child is immature. It doesn't mean they're bad, and we're not meaning immature is wrong. It just means they're kids, they're children. So the sacred child, or the golden child, hopefully emerges and matures into royalty. If we move over to the warrior is the hero. The immature version of the warrior is the hero. The hero thinks they're immortal. The hero thinks they're just going to achieve it all. The hero sometimes is very self-absorbed. The hero does heroic actions in order to get their own accolades oftentimes. So the hero is the immature version of the warrior. Hopefully the hero learns that they need to be in service to something bigger and greater than just their own identity or their own grandiosity. And so the hero is supposed to become the full-fledged and mature warrior. And the defining factor between the two of them is oftentimes service to something greater, but that service is that service is defined by this really powerful, sacred kind of discipline. And so the hero, the immature version, kind of has a hard time managing that. They're disciplined because they want to be good. They're disciplined because they want to be seen as the best. And they don't really give a crap about supporting other people or maintaining boundaries for the community. They just want to be seen as super duper. So the hero hopefully emerges and matures. I shouldn't say emerge, but the hero hopefully matures so the warrior can emerge. Okay, if we scooch over to the artisan. The artisan here, the child version of this, is the precocious child, is the child that is really into, a really wonderful version of this is in pop culture is Hermione Granger from, what's it called? I can't believe the Harry Potter stories. So Hermione Granger, as an immature, as a young girl, she is the precocious child who wants to know everything, who wants to have the best answers, who always wants to give the answers. And this is a child that is wonderful and wicked intelligence. We want curiosity, we want investigation, but we have to understand that the growth that Hermione goes through from her beginning years and then emerging into a actual scholar, that's a maturation that occurs, because in the beginning it's because she wants to be seen as the smartest and best, and hopefully that's going to protect her in her life. And the emergences into her scholarship is she's no longer in service to just, protecting herself or making herself look good. She's there in service of something greater, which is, battling the big bad and maintaining the school and all that shit. So then when we scooch over to the poet, into the lover, what's it called? The child here is considered to be the sacred child. And this is a very spiritually focused child. This is a child that is considered to be very focused on communion and connection and mysticism and different things along those lines. So the point is that each one of these have child aspects, immature versions, and in the immature versions, there are lessons of decentralization, of not being so self-absorbed, and that is the marker of maturation into something greater. So pretty much what is shared through all the child stuff, inner child, golden child, wounded child, is that any kind of child conversation is for us, most of us in Western world, is this recognition that we need to honor our sacredness and our sweetness, and that we should be taken care of. Most of the time for Westerners, it's the work with children is all about recognizing that you're worthy, but also not getting caught up in your worthiness, and that you're the most worthy, or you're the only one that's worthy. So we want to make sure that we recognize you're worthy, yes, but you want to mature into something. I also need to give worth and protection and contribute to a greater process. I need to be in communion with that which is greater. I need to have access and understanding of that which is greater than me, the transcendent. So in our archetypal conversation, in a healthy human being, as far as what we suggest in ITB, which we carry forth from other teachers, is that it is wise to be aware of the archetypes, these prototypes that live inside of us, these structures of consciousness that we are connected to and are making relationship to in every decision with every activity. It's better to know what they are, know how they perform, know that they exist, so we can make conscious choices in relationship with them, instead of kind of them coming to haunt us, them coming to, by not knowing about that content in that territory, then blowing up in our faces. So it's one of those deals where, as per usual in ITB, explore your territory, because that which is unexplored is most likely going to hamstring you, bite you on your butt later. It's not usually the stuff that we know about that causes trouble in our life. It's usually the stuff that we don't know about that causes trouble in our life, or that we've avoided that causes trouble in our life. So in ITB, when it comes to archetypes, we suggest study them, at least the basic value of them, all right? Get an idea of what they are, because they're a wonderful way to articulate and explain this human experience that we're going through. Also, we are kind of beholden to them, because all of our forebears, including non-human species on this planet, have been living by them for God knows how long. And so we are kind of like, we can deny them, but they're still going to act upon us. Similar to the analogy I had earlier of the sun. The sun is there whether you believe it's there or not. And so you can either make decisions in relationship to the sun, or you can let the sun act upon you and act like you don't know what's happening. So we do want to have information and be informed when we go forwards with this material. So in ITB, this is what we offer. One of the things that we do in ITB, that's more or less my lecture there, so I'm going to do a little bit of a plug here. So in ITB, when you work with a steward, if you do want to explore this territory, we often do bring up voices inside of us, and that does allude to these archetypes, and talking about how to work with these structures of consciousness and make relationship to them. And we find this to be really, really powerful. This is an educational tool we offer folks, and we guide them in the storytelling and in the connecting with these voices and working from these perspectives. So if you're working with a steward, this is definitely going to be some territory you can kind of dig into, and they can educate you on, and they can coach you through exploring these territories, so you can create healthy relationships with your archetypes and with your interior, and understand how your ebb and flow relationship occurs with them. So this can be very, very powerful work. So if you want to make contact with any of us at ITB, you can go to itb.org. I totally just made up that. That is not our website. I apologize. You can go to embodyingitb.org. So go to embodyingitb.org. You can take a look at our stewards. You can take a look at some of the things that we offer online these days, as well as we move out of this territory of the quarantine, what you can do face-to-face with folks, and how we can include body work and different things along those lines. So very, very helpful stuff as far as that's concerned. Also on our Facebook and Instagram pages, you'll see links to where you can connect with other stewards and connect with other folks in ITB that can be supportive of these types of deals. So we both have Facebook presence and Instagram presence, and you can find out more about what we do with these archetypes through those platforms. So definitely food for thought as you go forwards. All right.